Futures trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hi, it's Steve and Joe from Fresh Agenda, Everegg's Global Insights team. And Steve, we're back. We've had a week off. We were in San Antonio, Texas last week for the IDFA forum. And we had a lot of conversation, Steve, which we'll touch on in a moment when we do our outlook in a page.
Yeah, a bit of a challenge, I know there's always interest in keeping this tight, but let's see if we can't just do it in a page. Then we've got some other things to talk about, GDT and, of course, the chart of the week. This is something we took from your presentation materials, but I thought it would be interesting to just focus our discussion on the 6 main things that we seem to be having most of our work cut out for us in. And these were the things that people want to talk about last week when we were over in Texas. So take us through them, Joe. We'll start it off.
Well, I'll kick it off, Steve. EU milk growth, that's still a big topic of conversation and still a lot of, I suppose, mixed messages in terms of how things are looking for the spring. We see the 2 major producers in France and Germany still down week on week in their data. Ireland making a good recovery. Poland's still up. But yeah, in terms of where EU milk growth is going and what that means for product mix, that's still a burning question, Steve.
So the second point there is about the tight EU butterfat market, which is relaxing. No spoilers, but we'll talk about that later. But just the use of milk as we see milk seasonally rising and the increased availability, but how is the product mix going to react to that? And what does that mean for butterfat supplies and how the cheese market is managed, which is quite delicate.
Sure. And then the next point, number 3 there, Steve, New Zealand product mix. Given that there's still pretty weak demand for whole milk powder imports out of China, and New Zealand's having a really good season with milk production up year on year, how they're managing that product mix going forward and for the season to date. They're limiting whole milk powder and managing that fairly carefully to maintain value, but also wanting to limit their skim milk powder exposure as well. So we've seen that big increase that we've talked about before in terms of MPC exports, but really, shaping the product mix to try and preserve the value of that production.
Okay, number 4 is the US, the challenges facing US milk growth. And obviously this is probably in just about every conversation last week and something we're paying quite a lot of attention to. And the filling of the cheese capacity, which is coming on. We've done a lot of work on this with our US colleagues and just what the expectations are as to where that capacity is going to be filled from. And really how little of that is going to be with actual new milk. So that's the gist of much focus in the US right now, particularly with the release of the cattle report last week, which just adds to that dynamic.
Yeah, and the 5th point there, Steve, is we're calling the reshaping of the skim milk powder market. And there was a lot of discussion last week at IDFA about SMP and DFM. In terms of what's happening in global trade, we've seen the US very limited production of skim milk powder, those ongoing issues with avian flu in California limiting production, as well as, just the diversion of milk solids to other products. The same story really out of the EU, and in the absence of those 2 major exporters, really New Zealand stepping in to fill the gap, particularly in Southeast Asia. But again, as we said earlier, also just trying to manage that supply and demand to maintain the value in skim milk powder. And we'll see some interesting results of that in the next little while.
Point number 6 was about the very firm high-protein whey market, which soldiers on and prices keep sort of moving up. So, how durable is this? What's happened to demand? How lasting and all that? So we have some specialists in our team look at that all the time, but that's that's a fairly dynamic space right now.
And certainly a big conversation piece last week, Steve.
Yeah. And lastly, one not on the chart, Joe, but, in a lot of conversations about tariffs, will they, won't they, who's impacted? And, since we were there, there's been, a lot happen or not a lot happen. Depends how you look at it. Everything's been kicked down the road a bit.
Certainly for Canada and Mexico.
Yeah. And so a pretty dynamic issue. That's really that's a wrap, and that's what took most of the attention and most of the conversations that we're involved in last week. But also these are really focal points for how we're looking at the outlook. So GDT number 373, pretty interesting result. A lot went on. Just starting off, I mean, it's a 3.7% gain. Best in a little while, but driven by powders. So whole milk up on average 4.5. For the C2 contract up 4.1, we'll talk more about that later, but EU prices, which are part of the platform, they weakened, so that impacted the average. Skim milk powder, though, up around 4%, but stunning result for New Zealand product, which lifted 7%. The best gain was in C2. Other products or other contracts were smaller. But again, the EU product was flat in that result. So it's just really extended the premium. For C2, it's up to $500 a tonne over the corresponding EU contract. So that's huge.
A lot of action there in powder, Steve. But with butter, it was also an interesting story, up near 3.4% overall. New Zealand product was up around 4%. But again, this divergence between New Zealand and EU prices, with EU product down 2.2%. So that premium again opening up there. Cheddar was also up around 4%. Young cheddar C2 contract prices were up 4.5%. EU mozzarella was flat, and you'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while, Steve. Volumes sold, though, were 33% down compared to 5 events ago, and well down year on year, Steve. So, I guess you have to ask the question, how much of an influence that reduced product offering had
across products.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, demand, Jo.
Yeah, look, we commented that the chart is new, but the comments are the same as last time around. So pretty strong demand in whole milk powder and butter, weak for AMF, but prices actually lifted this time. So, some interesting demand trends there.
And that could be all about some of the charts I love to go to, but we won't for that particular case.
Yeah, so just staying with whole milk powder now, Steve, it was 2.4% up on the last, positive pulse event, and 4.1% up on the last auction. So you see that very nice rise in those bars there. We're at the highest point since April 2022, which was really, a bit of a time of very good Chinese demand. So it's interesting that we're here and China's not really that great. In terms of China's purchasing, involvement dropped to just 25% of the volume, Steve. But again, those volumes are well down. So this chart is measuring metric tonnes, although we don't have the numbers on the side there. It's volume. So less involvement, but also less volumes overall. This event sales were actually 19% below the corresponding event last year. So a real drop in terms of whole milk powder availability. And the Middle East is sticking with it despite these increasing prices, Steve, which we've sort of been used to them just popping up when prices are low, but they're sticking with it this time. Not quite 30% of sales on this event for whole milk powder.
Going across to skim milk powder, again, nice increase there, up 5.5% on the previous pulse and 7%, as I said earlier, on the last auction. Just finishing a shade under for the C2, under $3,000 a tonne, and the highest we've seen on the platform since December 22. And this is one of my favourites because skim demand in the starting rounds was on average, but it just lingered longer at a higher level. So the demand, that pushes the mechanism higher and delivered a very strong result. When we look at buying regions, China bought just under half, but with lower volumes, it meant a slight drop in sales. And looking at Southeast Asia, they lifted their participation to more than a third, and that was enough to lift the volume. But trajectory there is down, obviously with the seasonality of the offer, but still we looked at, in this event, well above the prior year.
So where does this all leave us, Steve? Well, New Zealand is now well ahead of the others. We've been used to talking about US skim milk powder or non-fat dry milk, way out of whack with the other regions. But now we've got the situation where the GDT prices achieved at this auction have finally caught up with the futures, which have also been well ahead of GDT results for months and months. So interesting.
Can it hold, Joe? That's the tricky bit, because that's, elevated values, which is the price-sensitive markets, which, now look at pretty strong pricing, just how long that remains the case.
It doesn't seem sustainable. But what about butter, Steve?
So again, we've got GDT results this time very close to the EU pricing. And that's, here we got here. We thought it would be the other way around, that Europe would come down. And the European prices look pretty flat in that forward curve for latest EEX the night before the result. Still a fair bit of backwardation in the futures for NZX. We don't have the AMF numbers up here. They're worse. But that's a pretty strong result for butter. And again, dominated by Chinese buying, pretty strong result for demand.
Yeah, and just looking at some of these, I guess, comparisons or equivalencies, Steve, that we like to look at from time to time, the AMF premium compared to butter in fat equivalents, that discount's just growing, Steve. Still the second largest discount on GDT. And general trade has started to gain some traction. So we've seen the New Zealand December export, Steve, a little bit more activity in terms of AMF there. Will this continue to be the case, or will AMF sort of claw back a bit of that ground? In terms of this other great chart that I really like, comparing the whole milk value to the value of EU skim milk powder and New Zealand AMF. And again, we're still seeing whole milk powder has got a premium that has continued to grow with this latest event. It's the highest gap, in fact, compared to that analogue product since March 2022. So again, interesting, really strong value for whole milk powder, given where we are in terms of Chinese demand, Steve.
Mozzarella, as we said in the opening, fell very slightly, but staying just above 4,000 euros per tonne. Not a lot of movement there, not a lot of movement for 4 events, really. It's quite interesting, just steadying despite what's going on in the fat market in the background. Chart of the week, Joe, how do you bring it home?
Well, we're staying in Europe, Steve, and we've been watching this sort of, the dynamic of the milk, cream and butter market in terms of the EU. We came back from the festive break thinking that we'd see the usual seasonal decline. We saw a little bit of rally, but now that seems to have run out of puff. Some of that probably associated with the confusion around the foot and mouth disease outbreak in Germany and what impact that might have in terms of sourcing product. But we're now seeing this increase in cream availability with more milk coming on at this time of the season. It's pressuring butter prices, but it's still a pretty bumpy ride there, Steve, and still at historically high levels.
And the futures market, Joe's followed this.
Yeah, well, the futures markets followed this down this last week. So you can just see really slumping, particularly through those into spring and just beyond spring from March to August. So, I think we're starting to see that easing of the butter market, Steve, just as that seasonal supply starts to come on stream. And again, some of that concern about the FMD outbreak subsides.
Okay, well, that's all from us. Thanks for watching. We'll be back again next week.